Hello everyone and welcome to Chem Safety's latest hazardous substances webinar. I'm Janet Konecki, a Senior Consultant with Chem Safety and a Compliance Certifier. I've been with Chem Safety for coming up to 23 years, which is a bit of a long time, and I've seen a thing or two out there looking at your hazardous substances. If you have any questions as we go through the session today, please put these in the Q&A and we'll review those at the end. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. These will either be covered as we go or we'll be in contact directly with you as needed afterwards. Our details will also be in the follow-up email, which we sent to you by our sales manager, Chrissy Cowie, and that will include a link to the recording of today's session and some useful online resources. So in today's session, I've got three topics that we'll be covering. An update on the GHS transition, a wee bit of a rant about signage, and a refresher on the types of locations that you can keep your flammable liquids at. So we'll start with the GHS, the Globally Harmonised System of Classification and Labelling of Chemicals. And time just flies, doesn't it? So in April 2021, 4 years ago, we had a look at the then upcoming changes to the classification system that we used. That webinar is still available. And what we'll do today is we'll have a bit of a recap through those changes and what that has meant. So the timeframes that we were looking at back then is most of the new notices and changes and classifications came into force April 2021. Any new approvals that were made in that time needed to comply straight away. Last couple of weeks ago, at the end of April, the 4-year transition for labelling, safety data sheets and packaging came to an end, and we're going to go into more detail about that. And I just want to put a wee note on there that I had put an April 2026 deadline for the regulations to be updated. That's not technically correct, so what the actual requirement is if there are any new hazardous substance regulations made after that date, then they must use the classification system. They don't necessarily need to change the current ones if they're not going to be updated. And it does take a very long time to change regulations. So for a few more years yet, we'll be having the two systems side by side, the HAZNO classification and the GHS classification. And that main difference that we saw with the change in the classifications was really about the names that we use to identify them. So a 3.1A classification under HAZNO became a flammable liquids category 1 hazardous substance. The correlations are in place and the regulations, each classification must be seen as the equivalent of the correlated classification in the classification notice, and we've got a number of charts available that detail what that correlation is, and we'll include those with the email that goes out. The correlation works really well because the HAZNO classifications that we've had for more than 20 years now were based on the very first draft of GHS, so they're similar with a few differences. With the change in classifications, there was also a number of approvals that were consolidated and a number of individual approvals that can fit under the scope of a group standard were revoked. So EPA have on their website now an approvals index and an approvals database. So that approvals index does include details of any approvals that were revoked and also substances that were previously classed as hazardous but now are not. So for example, the category 6.1E, acute toxicity, category 5, we haven't adopted that. So an example substance for that would be salt, sodium chloride. It has an eye irritancy, but it no longer has an acute toxicity classification as we don't have that low level there. So if you have looked for a substance and you can't quite find the approval, it may have been revoked. Those substances are still approved. They're just approved under a group standard now. We were looking forward back in 2021 for a new guide on the classification of hazardous substances. That guide did appear, has been published there, and so that summarises the classification criteria, including the New Zealand specific adoptions of GHS and the New Zealand specific category of hazardous to the terrestrial environment that we have maintained, which isn't part of the GHS at the moment. So if you are looking at needing to classify your substances, that guide is available. The EPA notices were updated with the GHS, and as I said, those came into force in April 2021. So the classification was the big one, the disposal one, the hazardous property controls, and the importers and manufacturers notice. Now, there's been some additional changes since then to that notice, which we'll look at just shortly. But there were transitional provisions up till April last month around labelling, safety data sheets, and packaging. So the importers and manufacturers notice, when it was first published, it really only required importers and manufacturers to notify EPA that you exist and that you're an importer or manufacturer of hazardous substances. With the changes that have been made to this, and they come into force in January 2026, all importers and manufacturers will need to supply updated business information, contact details, locations, your New Zealand business number, and the approval numbers of the substances that you import or manufacture. So if you've already supplied your contact information, there'll be a month period at the beginning of next year to provide that additional information, the business number and the approvals of your substances through to EPA. They've also introduced annual reporting for active ingredients for some substances. So for agrochemicals, timber treatment chemicals, anti-sap stains, anti-fouling, and some veterinary medicines, there will be annual reporting required of the mass of the active ingredient in those. And that will be starting for this calendar year. So for 2025, you'll need to be reporting that information through to EPA from January next year, and there's a 5-month period. So you've got from January to May to submit those reports if you're an importer or manufacturer of those substances. Reporting is not required for fertilisers or for the fumigants, methyl bromide or EDN. They have their own reporting requirements. So what I looked at in the previous webinar was a bit of a recap of what end users of hazardous substances need to do. So as a check back there, are you familiar with the classification terminology? You'll be seeing it so much more on your labels and safety data sheets, and indeed they have to be on there now at the moment. You can incorporate those into your documents, keeping the HAZNO classifications as part of what you do, because as I said, the regulations still refer to those. And another great time to check in, are you confident in your hazardous substance compliance? Location certification, I mean, we're still getting people coming to us for these who probably needed to have one for the last 20 years and are just sort of realising it. But things change all the time. People get new locations, and it's always fantastic when we get people coming to us who are planning a new build or a new facility or a change in something, and check what the requirements are before they get too far down in the planning. So please keep that up. Right. So the transitional period ended on the 30th of April 2025, so that the importers, manufacturers and suppliers now need to make sure that you are complying with all these notices. And we do have a number of the suppliers and major retailers have been doing a big push to ensure over the last 6 months or so that everything they're getting is up to date. So in practice, it's been longer than 4 years. So while the 2021 change gave a 4-year transition, that was sort of built on a transition that was in place with the 2017 group standards, and they sort of allowed things from the change to the HSW Act in 2017 to come through. So there's been a kicking the can down the road almost in relation to the labelling and safety data sheets for some substances, and all those transitions have now ended. So the key things are importers and manufacturers need to ensure that your labelling the safety data sheets and your packaging complies with the new EPA notices. If they complied with GHS 5, which was introduced in the 2017 EPA notices, then they should comply with the GHS 7 requirements. There might be some changes around some flammable gases, but that's not as many of those. There are some minor differences in the precautionary statements, and that's okay. It's not going to be word for word in there as long as the correct intent is done. That's not a license to reword or be a bit more creative with your wording, but if there's a slight difference, then it's not going to be a problem there. With the packaging regulations or the packaging notice, the main difference is better alignment with the international requirements for transport and child-resistant packaging. So again, international alignment is in there. So with your suppliers, you need to make sure that what you're getting from your end supplier or what you're selling has the compliant labeling on them. You've got the right safety data sheets, they're up to date with the correct information, and that the packaging does comply. So there's an obligation both for the importer or manufacturer and for the supplier to make sure that what is being provided to the end users complies. And this applies across all hazardous substances. It's not just things going into workplaces. So this covers all our consumer hazardous substances. Suppliers also need to be aware of the substances that can only be supplied to workplaces, and I'll detail that shortly. Big red writing there, and EPA have been very clear in this, that if you've got old stock, there is no more grace period, or you can't sell through your old stock. That was the point of the 4-year transition period, to give everyone in the supply chain a chance to get those things updated and sell out any old stock. So I've noticed out and about when I've been shopping, because you always look at the hazardous substances when you're shopping, that there have been products and you've just noticed an additional sticker on them, which has just got the additional information that might have been missing from their labels. So you may see that as you're out and about, which is perfectly fine. The information is there. There might be some stuff that still hasn't been updated, that there's a few bits that need to be done. Obviously, it's quite a logistical issue to go around and put stickers on everything. But time goes on and we've got to the end of that transition. EPA do have published on their website as well what their enforcement strategy is around these. Part of the whole purpose of the GHS is that it is a globally harmonised system. And so we want to limit the need to have different requirements for different countries. So when you're dealing with international trade. So you can use the rules from specified countries, so that's Australia, the EU, the United States and Canada, as a means of alternative compliance. And you can follow those rules for whether you're importing them or exporting them, or just for use in the New Zealand market. So it's you're able to use the same rules here and for products you might export. If you're importing, those products don't need to have come from those countries, but they must be following the rules for them. So if, for example, you've got a safety data sheet from Kazakhstan for some of their fine potassium, Kazakhstan's not a member of the EU, but if their safety data sheet complies with the EU regulation, then that's okay. You can adopt that under these alternative compliance provisions. And the same applies for the UK post-Brexit. It's no longer a member of the EU. Their rules are still consistent with them. So if their safety data sheets or their labelling or their packaging complies with the EU regulations, then that's okay, with the addition of the required New Zealand specific information. So for labels, that includes having the importer or manufacturer contact details, having a free phone number for certain classifications, such as the Poison Centre, and the New Zealand specific agrochemical information around terrestrial ecotoxicity needs to be included too. Safety data sheets need to have the same information as the labels, And if you are going to be putting the Poison Centre phone number on your safety data sheet and your labels, you need to ensure that you follow their procedure for supplying them with a safety data sheet, so that when your customers ring up and say, well, little Johnny's swallowed something that he shouldn't have done, the Poison Centre can access the safety data sheet that you're using them as part of your, not customer support, but emergency support there. It's really important to make sure that the name that is on your safety data sheet for the product matches what you put on the label. Consistency is the key here. And so then at your workplace, make sure you're putting the name of the product that matches the label and the safety data sheet in your inventory. If you call it something else on site, you can add that as well. The safety data sheet needs to include any recommended uses or restriction on supply, including those that are for supply to workplaces only. There are some classifications that aren't adopted by the overseas jurisdictions. So, for example, flammable liquids category 4, 3.1D, is not a classification that's been adopted by the EU. So if you've got a combustible liquid, you'll need to add that information to it. You need to make sure that you've included the New Zealand approval number and the exposure limits. And in order to get the approval number, then you need to know what the classification is to make sure that you can assign it to the correct group standard. For the packaging requirements, these changes have mainly, or the alternative compliance provisions, relate to child resistance packaging and permanent identification. Just got to be really careful that you are checking which classifications your product is, because the New Zealand requirements for child resistant packaging can be a bit broader than those international ones. So make sure that they are appropriate for the substances that you have. And then it's really important as well that you keep a record. So if you are relying on the alternative compliance provisions here, you need to have a record that shows that you are intending to rely on that provision and what jurisdiction it is that you're looking at. And you need to make sure that you've got enough information so that you are confident that the labelling or the safety data sheet or the packaging complies with that overseas jurisdiction. As I said earlier, it's not just on imported materials. You can use those rules for your own labels as well. So be sure that you are fully compliant. The requirements for substances that are supplied only to a workplace isn't something that's covered by the transition. It has been in place since 2021, but it's probably really only last year that we started having intelligence out from the field that the EPA was looking at enforcing this provision. So this is part of the Hazardous Property Controls Notice. So this covers the rules for hazardous substances that are not in a workplace. And there are a range of substances or classes of substances that are to be supplied only to workplaces. So they're listed here. There's some additional named substances and some exemptions as well. So flammable liquids category 1, that would include petrol. So petrol has been excluded from that. Members of the public can buy petrol and fireworks and some other ammunition and flares, for example. The 6.1 A and B, your acute toxicity category 1 and 2, these are classes that require a certified handler. So as part of the sales process, the supplier would need to be checking that they've got a certified handler certificate for those ones. But the rest of these other substances don't necessarily need a certified handler. And so the requirement that the supplier needs to check that it's going to an authorised person or a competent person is that they've had the required information, instruction and training. There's not a specific certificate or form or document that you can provide to that. So when people are needing to buy these substances, different forms of documentation or letters or course attendance certificates have been done there. If you've got an interesting hobby, then you can apply to the EPA for permission if you needed some of these more dangerous substances. The one that probably tricks people up the most is the acute toxicity category 3. So there's 6.1C, a few substances in there that get caught up, that people are being asked for information or certificates or training. And it can be confusing because if the supplier's not quite sure what they're asking for, yeah, that can get confusing there. But we're always happy to help clarify things. A lot of the substances listed here, it's not going to be an issue. Organic peroxides type A, they're so hazardous, you're not even allowed to transport them. So it's not likely that they're going to be readily available for sale. So some of the common issues that we see around the labelling, the packaging and the safety data sheets is importers or manufacturers, particularly small-scale ones, not having a good understanding of their duties when it comes to these requirements and not having enough knowledge about the products that they might be importing. If there's not good documentation on the safety data sheets from their overseas supplier, then it can be really hard to apply it to the correct approval in New Zealand. With labelling, the labelling information is required on the primary container, so the bottle that the substance is in, as well as the primary pack, which is the box or the blister pack that it might be sold in as well. And then there's transport information, which is a bit different, that's required on the outer carton or packaging that's actually going to be handled and transported. As I said, making sure you've got sufficient information to be able to determine the hazard classification. And also be aware that while there are those alternative compliance provisions for overseas safety data sheets, you can't necessarily rely on an overseas GHS classification. So when you're starting to look at your broader compliance, then the classification is the one that is correct for the New Zealand implementation of GHS and the New Zealand approval classification. So for substances that have an individual approval, the classification stated on that is the one that must be used for your compliance. And there's only a few cases, but there are some cases where there's been differences. And the other one that perhaps causes some confusion when we're looking at safety data sheets is around hazardous substances versus dangerous goods. And so if you've got something that's a dangerous good, there's generally a good correlation between the classifications of that are dangerous goods and the GHS classifications. But you might have, particularly with consumer products, provisions under the transport rules for small-scale transport that don't require the full DG transport requirements, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the product's not a DG, it's just that the quantities and packaging that it's being transported in for that particular shipment doesn't require those dangerous goods requirements. So that's about it for the GHS at this stage. So now we're going to move on to what hasn't changed with the GHS. And the changes to the GHS haven't or shouldn't have affected your signage. So I want to have a minor rant around pictograms and signage. So what are the pictograms? This is what we're looking at. We've got one source of pictograms, which is our globally harmonised system of classification and labelling of chemicals. So that's really coming through from a labelling perspective. And then we've got the recommendations on the transport of dangerous goods, the UN model regulations. And these are around transporting things safely. So the placarding on the vehicles, the diamonds that go on the outer packaging and your drums and your tankers and all those things. Neither of these are specifically designed for site signage. The EPA notices and the GHS for labelling allow the use of the DG pictograms on labelling when they are applicable. And if you just have a look at these, I'd hope it's obvious that the GHS ones are all very similar, very consistent, red border, black picture, that perhaps at a distance can be hard to distinguish, particularly the flammable and oxidizing ones. Whereas the dangerous goods ones are very colourful, easy to tell at a distance what we're looking at. The regulations state that the regulations around signage at workplaces where you've got your hazardous substances say you must use pictograms or hazard statements that are consistent with the correct classification of the hazardous substance. It doesn't say GHS or DG. And so WorkSafe's current position appears to be that as the regulations are silent, you can use either. And that's what they say here in this excerpt from the Hazardous Substances Toolbox. You can use either, and they give the example of GHS. This one here is for an organic peroxide. But if we have a think about what the purpose of signage is, it's to provide sufficient warning to people and especially emergency services of the nature of the hazard they may be facing. So if you've got a sign at your flammable liquid store, people on site know what it is. When the fire service vents turn up to an alarm or a fire after hours, the only source of information they have on site in front of them are the signs that you have. So it needs to be really clear to them what the hazard that they are facing is. If we look at some examples, if we take these ones, then there's pretty good alignment. We've got an oxidizing one here, we've got an oxidizing one there for our oxidizing gases, liquids, and solids. The yellow is obviously nice and bright and clear. Same with corrosives, they do match up. We do have a situation where we've got the serious eye damage, so that's not a dangerous goods for transport. In most cases, the ones that are going to cause eye corrosion perhaps cause skin corrosion as well. So there's not too much of a deal there for these ones. The real issue comes with the flammability. There's one GHS flammable pictogram, which we saw before, can be confused a little bit with the oxidizing one at a distance, is doing some really heavy lifting over the classes of substances that it is trying to identify. And if you've got people on site, if you've got a site that has a mix of these different stores, of these different substances, they're all incompatible with each other. They shouldn't be in the same store. So if your store signs all just have this pictogram, it makes it harder for people on site to ensure that the right substances go in the right stores. So while the regulations do allow the use of GHS and signage on site, the feedback that we've had from first responders and just on site ourselves is the clearer the information, the better you're managing the risk. And so that if there are applicable DG pictograms, we really like to see these ones on signs rather than the GHS ones. Rant over. So we'll take a bit of a pause now and change tack and have a look at flammable liquids locations. And I wanted to have a look at this just as a bit of a refresher on what the requirements, what the different options are, the different characteristics of the locations where we can keep flammable liquids. This information is found in Part 11 of the Hazardous Substance Regulations, and the purpose is to control the adverse effects of unintended ignition. If something goes pear-shaped, let's make sure we've got some infrastructure in place to contain or limit the spread of fire. We're not relying on people reacting. In basic terms, if it's in a fireproof box and away from stuff that we don't want to get burned, then things are going to be better. So under Regulation 11.4, there are some small quantities that don't have to be at a specific location type. So this is where it's subpart 1 does not apply. So if you've got less than 15 litres of class 3.1A or 3.1B in securely closed containers, not exceeding 5 litres capacity, then they can be in general storage. But if you've got a 10-litre petrol can, or you've got, look at that stockpile of hand sanitizer that for some reason you bought 5 years ago, it just can't be sitting out in the workshop or warehouse or garage there. The quantities increase with 3.1C and 3.1D. Common examples: petrol, 3.1A, methylated spirits, acetone, 3.1B, kerosene or terps, 3.1C, a lot of your oil-based paints sit there as well, and 3.1D, and a common example there is diesel. So those are some of the things that can be in more general storage. say, as soon as you've got a 20-litre container of petrol, then it needs to be in a designated location type. And so these location types are designated in subparts 1 and 2. The difference between these is whether you do or don't need location compliance certification, whether you've exceeded or not exceeded the hazardous substance location. Generally speaking, those requirements under each of those subparts are the same. So there's mostly duplication between those two subparts. It means that once you've got over these thresholds where subpart 1 doesn't apply, then you need to have a compliant location type, whether or not you exceed the location certification threshold. So what are these location types? Well, we can have our stores where we keep our closed containers, or you may do a limited amount of decanting, and these can be either inside a building or outside a building. So our outside stores type A, B, C, D, and our 1, 2, or 4 hour fire rated stores in the building. We can have our flammable liquids cabinets, which usually comply with AS 1940. There's another standard allowed as well. If you are using or you've got open containers of flammable liquids, then these need to be in a type 1, 2, or 3 workroom. But there are also provisions for using small quantities that are not in a workroom. And a couple of other situations. So the small quantities that we just spoke about, paint mixing rooms and retail shops come into play here. I'm not going to talk about retail shops today as they can have some complex issues. And I'm also not going to go into details of laboratories, which again have some of their own very complex issues. And there's ongoing work around safe work instruments for them. I'm also not going to go into hazardous areas or ventilation. I'll just say that the regulations are strangely quiet on the requirements for ventilation for these areas. And so then you need to go and look at your requirements for risk management, both under regulation, I want to say 3.2, and the general risk and workplace management regulations, and looking at worker exposure as well. So just because they're not explicitly stated doesn't mean there aren't requirements to have appropriate ventilation. Okay, we'll start with our most common stores. Probably the most common one we come across is a type B. But type A is as simple as a bunded compound which can be secured from unauthorised access. So if it's got a platform or a roof, it needs to be non-combustible materials, and it needs to be secured from unauthorised people. A type B store is a framed building with a non-combustible cladding, or, for example, a converted shipping container is illustrated here, or a concrete bunker or a metal shed there. Doesn't have a fire rating, should be the doors of the same non-combustible material as cladding. You commonly get asked, how much can I store in these? And the answer is as much as you like, if you have the space and if you've got the secondary containment for it. If you don't have space on your site, then you can have up to 250 litres in these stores if they're in the smaller containers, and that can be right up against your building. And we'll have a look at some of the other distances shortly. Moving up to fire-rated stores, so we've got our type C and our type D. And so these need to be of structurally strong materials. Type D needs a fire-rated roof. Type C just needs a non-combustible roof, and we're looking at 2 or 4 hour fire rated. You must have the evidence and the documentation of the fire rating of these. For some of the older stores, if we go back pre-HAZNO to the old DG regulations, so this is, basically last century, last millennium, the requirements for type C and D buildings under those DG regulations were around the construction types, but they didn't specify fire rating. So you might have had a store that's been in place for 25 years and it's been noted as being type C because it was constructed with the right materials, but you might not have the evidence of the fire rating of it. So particularly for any store, make sure you've got that evidence of fire rating. For the doors, there will be tags on the doors and on each element of the door. So in the picture there, each of those doors and the frame should have its own tag that specifies the fire rating, because the door doesn't achieve its fire rating until all the elements have been put together and installed. Do make sure that if you're getting new doors in place that you chase up your supplier to get those tags put in. The number of times that they've got new doors in, but the tags haven't been installed. There's been a lot of that. If your type C or D store is a standalone store, so it's not connected to another building, then you are allowed a lesser rated door there. It doesn't have to have that fire rating. Again, there's no limit on the quantity, provided that you've got the required distance. And if we needed a 0 metre distance because we were right up against another building, for a type C, you can have 1,000 litres, the smaller containers, or type D, you can get some quite significant quantities there as well. And we'll look again at some of those distances. So it might be a wee bit hard to read here. But so the separation distance for type A, B, C, and D, they depend on the container size and the classification. So if you've got containers less than 60 litres of your 3.1A or B and your packages of 3.1C, then we'd use this table with the smaller distances, the purple example, and if you've got large containers or ABCs, then would use the ones I've got in the red. So I've given us an example here of the distances that would apply for 2,000 litres of 3.1B. If you've got the space, and it would need 7 metres for a type A or B store, and drums of 3.1B, you could do that. If you don't have 7 metres distance around your store from your protected places, then you would either need to see if you can reduce your container size, that would drop the distance down to 3 metres, or looking at a fire rated store there. And those distances, they get quite large very quickly for your type A or B when you're dealing with like drums of alcohol. Moving on to flammable liquids cabinets, so commonly found in all sorts of places. They need to comply either with AS 1940 or be a 60-minute fire rated one to the British European standard that's stated there. You can't have containers bigger than 20 litres inside the cabinet, and there's a maximum quantity aggregate of your 3.1 A, Bs and Cs of 250 litres. There are some cabinets on the market that state they've got a 350 litre capacity. Those are fine to use as long as you don't have more than 250 litres of these substances in them. Depending on the container size, you can often struggle to get those amounts in them anyway. There is a maximum capacity that you're allowed to have in your building. So if you had 3 250 litre cabinets, you could have those on your ground floor, up to 3 of those for 250 square metres. So depending on the size of the space that you're dealing with, limits the number of cabinets that you can have in the building. And then it's smaller, so 1 per that area on other floors. Separation distances to protected places are not required for compliant cabinets, and there are other flammable liquids, there is required to be separation from other flammable liquids cabinets when you're at a hazardous substance location. And we've had a few questions just about how the logistics of that works. And that can get complicated as well. So I'm not going to go into the detail of that today, but I will be in contact with those who had that question. Secondary containment, you're not likely to have exceeded the threshold for secondary containment in a cabinet, but it is part of the design and the construction requirements. You must ensure that the bottom shelf remains in place and you're not using the containment capacity for storage there. WorkSafe did publish a technical clarification on the construction requirements of cabinets last year, and it included a few points that are very good in making sure that they're closing and latching in order, and a couple of points that's still being talked about amongst in the industry with standards and cabinet suppliers and professional bodies around that. But do make sure that you are maintaining your cabinet in good condition, particularly around the closing mechanisms. And our last storage option we're going to have a look at is stores in a building. And we'll start with looking at stores that open directly into a building, so into a warehouse or other area there. We can have 1, 2, or 4 hour fire rated. And so we're looking at, for a 1 hour fire rating one, it just specifies that it has that fire rating. Whereas if we're moving up to a 2 hour fire rated store in a building, it does specify that it's made of reinforced concrete or equivalent there. The doors need to have their applicable fire ratings, and if there are vents in your 2 or 4 hour one, then they need to have fire rated dampers on them. A 1 hour store in a building can hold containers up to 20 litres and a maximum quantity of 450 litres. For a 2 hour store in a building, again, maximum container size is now 60 litres, but you can have 1 drum in there. If you've got up to 2,000 litres, then these doors can open directly into another part of the building, provided that the door is self-closing in the event of a fire near the doorway. So if it's not fully self-closing all the time, then it's on a fusible link or something like that. That there's no combustible materials held within 3 metres of the doorway, and no structures within 3 metres of the doorway are of combustible materials either, and that you keep that door closed when you're placing or removing goods from there. And secondary containment will be triggered by the normal threshold for that, but be best practice in any case, particularly if it's going to be opening into other parts of your building. Again, as with the type C and D stores, having the evidence of your fire rating is critical. If it's a build, so we might get a copy of the plans that have been submitted for building consent. That's great. That tells us that you are planning to build something with a 1 hour fire rating, and you're doing this with whatever specification of jib or hardy board or what thickness of concrete it is. We then need to see the producer statement or something afterwards that says it was actually built as planned. Plans do change, so we do need to make sure that we have got that evidence. We've had a real push over the last few years at trying to obtain that from people. The other type of store in a building is a type D store, so the same requirements for our 4 hour fire rating. And on the previous slide, that's what happens, is allowed if it opens directly into a building. If you've got more than 2,000 litres in it, then it needs to either open into a workroom, or the opening needs to be external to the building that it's in the corner of, for example. There are limits on the maximum quantity that's permitted in those. So if it opens into a workroom or has got more than 2 walls in common with another building, then there are limits of 5 or 10,000 litres, depending on the classifications that you've got. Paint mixing rooms, so usually associated with the paint activity. These are required to comply with AS/NZS 4114.1. There is a newer version of that standard, so if it complies with the newer version of the standard as well, then that's acceptable. We need, again, to have document evidence that the construction and the operation of the paint mixing room complies with that standard, including the ventilation system. So usually with your paint mixing room, there's a computer or something that's needed in there to operate what you're doing. And so those aren't intrinsically safe. So there's a purge and a ventilation system in there that's being used to control the hazardous area. So we need to make sure that that is all operational. Maximum container sizes of 20 litres, and again, no more than 450 litres of class 3 flammable liquids permitted in those. No separation distance, we've got a maximum quantity. Other uses of flammable liquids, if we're not doing it in a paint mixing room, are our workrooms. So we've got type 1, 2 and 3, 1, 2 and 4 hour fire rated. Same provisions, make sure we've got evidence of the fire rating. The doors need to open towards the outside of the building, be self-closing and have those fire ratings. And if there is a window in it, then it needs to comply with this standard as well. And I have come across some windows, and they do have their plate on them that say that they do comply. There's no restriction on the maximum container size, but if they are larger than these amounts, then they need to be held as close as practical to ground level. There is a maximum quantity of 7.5 or 10,000 litres, but in practice, most of the time your workroom is inside another building, so you're being constrained by a 0 metre separation to protected places. And for 3.1b, it's either 450, 1750 or 3,000 litres, depending on your fire rating. And the secondary containment for this needs to have 100% of the total pooling potential. So your total pooling potential is the total volume of hazardous liquids that you have in that workroom. So not just the amount of flammable liquids that you have. The other provision that I usually smile at is that your workroom is not allowed to be occupied as a dwelling. So do make sure that no one is living in it. If it was a standalone workroom, then you would have your separation distances to protected places that would allow those higher quantities there. For smaller quantities of flammable liquids, these can be used in spaces that aren't a fire-rated workroom. There's a particular provisions that are usually called the use not in a workroom. If you've got up to 30 litres being used, then your building must be occupied by the same organisation that's storing the hazardous substances. And where you are exposing the hazardous substances to the atmosphere, where it's open, where you're using it, then that part of the building needs to be constructed of fire-resistant materials for 6 metres all around it. If you've got more than 30 litres being used, then you've got these additional restrictions on limitations of ignition sources, which get quite big, so 15 metres or 6 metres there. So often if people are dealing with small quantities of flammable liquids, keeping sure that it's well below that 30 limit there. And it's also looking at the building in which this is happening, not just the smaller area. And that's it as a run through the different options that we have for flammable liquid storage. So we will move on and have a look and see what questions we have. And we do have some here. And some there. So one question there, do the safety data sheets still have to be issued, revised within 5 years? Yes, they do. So they need to be either revised when there's updated information or at least every 5 years. A question around signage, having more signage than the threshold requires. So if you've got a quantity of flammable liquids which is below the threshold, I imagine is having signage going to indicate a greater hazard than there is or is not. And the approach that I usually take to that is how significant is that difference. So if we're looking at a 250 litre threshold for 3.1b, if you had 200 litres in there, I would say it's still reasonable to have a HazChem sign with that signage there. But if you only had 5 litres, then you're overblowing what the risk is there. So it needs to be proportionate. But I wouldn't treat it as a black and white line that if you had 220 litres, then you must not have a sign. I wouldn't go in that far. I've got a question about safety showers, so I'll take that up as a separate question there. And definition of combustible materials, that's something that has come up a lot in the past as well, and the difference in the regulations talking about fire-resisting materials and combustible materials as well. So again, that's something that I'll take offline. We might put together a wee FAQ around these questions here. And there. And looking at, I guess, a bit more of a specific situation. And when transporting, if you are transporting hazardous substances, you must use the applicable dangerous goods for transport pictograms there do not use the GHS ones when it comes to transporting it. And so there's a particular provision both in the GHS and the transport one that if you have a GHS pictogram on a container, it must be part of the whole label for the container. For transport, you'll often just have the pictogram as a standalone sticker. So if there is a GHS diamond on a label, it must form part of that whole label that includes the product name and the contact details and the hazard statements and all those things. What rules apply for flammable liquids cabinet on a farm setting, e.g. for 350 litres of petrol storage? There are some special provisions around farms. I'd have to double check as to whether those are just in Part 10 or in Part 11 of the regulations. Are physical safety data sheets required? If there are digital ones accessible in the area? The requirement in the regulations at your workplace is that the safety data sheets must be accessible. And think about the situations in which you'd want those to be accessible. And that can often be, if you've had to evacuate the site, you might need to have some information about the safety data sheets there. So just think about what sort of accessibility you do have to those safety data sheets if you're only having them digitally. I know a number of sites that might have them on a USB stick. Make sure that your technology that you have with you is actually compatible with that these days, or on a laptop or available electronically through the cloud there. What I would usually say is if you've got substances in large quantities or that are your highest hazard ones where your biggest risk is, then you might want to consider having those as physical copies in addition to your digital access. But think about the scenarios that you have. This can come down as part of your emergency response plan testing as well, is going through and asking all those what if questions, and can I actually get this? And what if this happened during a power cut, or what if this happened at night? Those sorts of questions there. I don't think it's necessary to have 6 ring binders full to the brim of safety data sheets for 300 different colours of paint or ink, for example. It's not going to be useful to find things. For selling chemicals to a competent person, so that's coming back, I think, to the substances available only or to be supplied only to workplaces. It's certified handlers if it is class 6.1A or B and the explosives that need them. If you are a competent person, so anyone in a workplace working with hazardous substances must have had training that meets the requirements of Regulation 4.5. So that's everyone working with hazardous substances. How that is done can be done with a range of in-house training, external training, competency assessment, including in relation to this question, looking at what someone's degree might cover. If I think back to when I did my chemistry degree, we did a lot of learning about what the chemicals do to each other. We didn't do quite so much learning about what the chemicals do to us. So perhaps it might depend on the vintage of your chemistry degree as to what's covered there. But that does all build into what the competent person is. I think in most cases a letter from the business to the supplier has been sufficient to demonstrate that the person is competent for supply. I'm not going to look at the top of my head as to how much petrol you can transport before a sign, but we can have a look at that. So that's from an anonymous attendee. So it would be in the land transport dangerous goods rule as to the quantities of dangerous goods, including fuel or petrol, that can be transported before you need to have placarding or a dangerous goods endorsement. So that's where you would look for that. Can you have 2 chemical cabinets containing different chemicals next to each other? That depends. And I would look at that on a case-by-case basis. In relation to 6.1A and B and laboratories, so there are provisions under Part 18 that laboratories do not require have certified handlers. And so if the supplier is asking for the certified handle when one's not required for that laboratory, then documentation that the person has the required training that is listed under Part 18 should suffice. But I'm happy to look at that more closely, specifically later as well. And let's just move that one to look at the last question. Is it likely that the hazardous substance calculator will allow our safety data sheets to be uploaded at any stage? No, actually, that would be a question for WorkSafe, who hosts that calculator. I haven't heard of anything like that as it being used as a host for safety data sheets, but it's an interesting question there. All right, if anyone has any other questions, please don't hesitate to drop us a line. As I said, the email that goes out after this will have the details of our contacts and how to get hold of us, and the link to this recording. It will join our whole suite of webinars that are available on our YouTube channel. If there are any topics that you'd like to see in the future, whether it's a new one or a focus on a particular topic, please let us know. And similarly, if you would like to have any training or a seminar at your workplace or event, do get in touch. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.